Hi, everybody. Welcome to Road to Lead. I'm M. Michelle DeRosier. As you know, I created this podcast because I was having trouble finding case studies to help figure out how to transition into leadership spaces, especially in nonprofit, and particularly from the perspective of traditionally marginalized voices. I wanted to connect with leaders like Kahina Haynes, whom you'll meet in just a little bit, to discuss key takeaways for them going through the process of becoming executive directors or becoming CEOs of their nonprofits or in the social sectors that they lead. Really looking forward to all the gems that Kahina has to share. Welcome, Kahina. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Kahina Haynes here. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation. But as Michelle said, I am an executive director, and I currently serve as executive director for the Dance Institute of Washington in Columbia Heights, Washington, D.C. We are a unique organization in that we operate a creative placemaking strategy using a number of vehicles, including a pre-professional training program to advance equity and representation in pre-professional dance, and also to look at impact in other areas of community development. So in health, job access, job security, amongst other things. So a bit of everything, but our primary program is our dance training. So I'm super happy to be here. As I'm sure we'll get into, I had a unique launch into executive director. So I'm really happy and excited to share that experience and some learnings and things that I hope can continue to be part of the conversation for others.
Your unique launch into the ED role is one of the reasons why I thought you would serve so well for this. It's the Nonprofit Council that talks about the lack of preparation in nonprofits for the succession planning and how so many nonprofits run the risk of having to figure out in an emergency who is going to lead this organization. So I think that is a perfect transition for you to just tell us a little bit about how you came to be executive director.
Sure, absolutely. So I was hired by the founder of the Dance Institute of Washington, who was Fabian Barnes, and I was hired to direct the programming. And that was going well. There was a whole strategic planning session that took place, and I had really had it charted the waters for my career for the next 3 to 5 years. But unfortunately, the founder actually passed away unexpectedly about 6 months into my role. 6 months into the role. And this was at this stage, he had founded and led the organization for almost 30 years. So there was a long-standing, as you can imagine, from inception to where the organization was at that time, tons of institutional knowledge and know-how and insight about virtually everything that governed the organization. And we lost all of it overnight. And so what followed then, in terms of my experience, is I think exactly why these conversations are important, because I would certainly describe it, and I think this is putting it lightly, as we were in crisis mode. But in real terms, the board moved forward with putting together an interim strategy, and I was appointed as acting executive director, and later interim executive director, and then ultimately executive director of the organization. But that took almost 2 years, that entire process, because there was not a plan in place.
Can you just talk a little bit more? Did they approach you? Did you approach them? How did that conversation happen?
That is an excellent question. So I think we are unique, and I'm like shouting out to any founder-led organizations right now. We are different.
Yeah.
And that was the case with DIW. So because of that, the board and the organization operated very much founder-centric. And the reason I bring that up is because I think that had a significant influence on the response to the loss. I think it's important to acknowledge very, transparently that that's a grievance. That's a grievance period that the organization has to go to, losing a founder in that way, whether they move on to another role or they unfortunately pass or whatever the case may be. It is a loss still. And there's a period of grievance. And so I think that is very different than, say, an employer or an employed ED moving on, because that grieving and sort of loss is felt and experienced differently. And I think that impacts people's readiness or even the timing of how they respond. So all that to say, having lost a founder and with it having been a transition, of life, nobody approached anyone, I think, to be honest. People were quite stunned and shocked and kind of frozen for a number of weeks. And at that time, I had some of the more recent conversations with the founder leading up to this event. And it was on the strength really of those and me having a sense of like what he wanted to see happen, that I just simply approached the board with that information. I didn't know what they would do with it. I didn't know if they'd find it helpful. But the lesson there is that I think there's often this expectation that people in the roles know what to do. And I think if I've learned anything from crisis and transition is that you can really find yourself at a disadvantage with that, operating with that assumption. I think if you are in a position of leadership at an organization and you feel strongly about information you have or contributions, to feel free to propose them, to speak up, to reach out to, the board or other executives, because that ended up being the catalyst that got DIW into some rebuilding and some crisis management. I don't know, honestly, and it wasn't just me, it was myself and a couple of other close colleagues who said, we're not sure if this is protocol, but we feel like this needs to be said, and we have thoughts about how to move forward. We are not the board. We are not executives, but maybe, just maybe, they might find this helpful. And as it turns out, they really needed that information.
That is amazing. And a couple of really great gems that I'm pulling out of it is the closed mouth don't get fed, right? You would have done not only yourself a disservice, but you would have done the organization and the students that you serve a disservice by not providing insight that you have. And I like to tell my team, as the program people, the ones who are on the ground, on the front line, you have a lot more insight into what is good for the organization than a lot of people in leadership do, because you're hearing directly from the people that you're serving. So your role as you're figuring out how to move into leadership is, how do you process what you're hearing, package it, bring it over, and then help to move the organization along based on the feedback that you're receiving. And you did that perfectly, and it landed you in the space as ED.
Yeah.
I want to come back to a couple of questions, but in terms of being frontline, and I think of program as frontline, and knowing that, especially in nonprofits, there is a distinction between senior leadership and then leadership as they see it, not necessarily leadership when you're the person who's doing the program delivery. How did you gain the confidence to say, I'm just going to move forward with it and approach you?
That is an excellent question. Because I think it lifts up so many things, right? There are a lot of unmentioned there are nuances to this, right? I think this question is getting at. There are clear power dynamics at play. I am Black. I am a woman in this work. Right? The board was actually all male at the time of this event. There were some dynamics at play, but I think I want to kind of build on what you actually said, Michelle, which was, I saw it as a strength and a value add that I was in programming. I didn't see it as a weakness, or weakness isn't the right word, but I didn't feel like I had less power, even though I really kind of did, but I didn't feel that way. I felt like if we're talking about, and well, let me back up for a second. I think it also starts with defining, before you kind of jump out there, defining for yourself, anyone who's in this position, what your goal is. That's really important. And I want to name that. My goal wasn't necessarily to become the executive director. My goal was to ensure the continuation of the organization, which I later found out is a great quality for an executive. I think that's important, right? Because if I had set out to say, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to become ED, then I would have had a different relationship to that power dynamic. I would have felt, I don't think I'm qualified. I'm not in a position to do this up. I don't have the experience. But because my perspective, the goal for me was very clearly defined. I was like, I don't care who's in the seat, but this is what I know needs to happen. So this continues. And I felt anyone who's in programming knows you're uniquely qualified to pitch that better than board or sometimes executive leadership, as you so well articulated, Michelle. And that's what I went off of. I said, I didn't set out, I think, like I said, to have that sort of position and power conversation. It was about the work. That's what I led with. And because I was fluent in that, I felt very comfortable. I felt very secure in that conversation, because it wasn't about me coming as an employee to the board. It was me coming as a subject matter expert, right, about this work. And that's what it was.
Yes.
And that changed the landscape for me, and allowed me, because to be perfectly honest, it certainly was no walk in the park. I didn't just make it, oh, this is going to be easy. I had to reflect a lot, and I had a lot of conversations before reaching out, before that initial outreach. But that's where I kind of landed after enough conversations. That's exactly how I felt. I said, this is not about deciding, the successor at this time. This is about the work and who, right? The late founder handpicked me to govern the work. That was my job. So who better? And I think, as frontline, we don't always see that agency in ourselves, or that positioning. So that awareness and the naming of that, and kind of standing in that power, helped. That was what led me, I think, to be able to send that initial email.
You said a couple of things that I thought were really amazing. One was that you led with the purpose, right? You led with that passion, and it's something that we already have. So it's basically just tapping into something that's already there. And then you also approach this from your zone of genius, right? You were like, I know this program. I understand how it works. I work every day to deliver it, and I know the value of that. So of course I'm not going to be scared. Of course I'm not going to.
That's right.
You don't know anything about this program. So what am I concerned about?
Exactly.
So I think that is the perfect way to just take away some of the imposter syndrome sometimes, right? You're not approaching it from the perspective of this person has more power than me. You're approaching it from, I know this work inside out, and I'm going to speak to what I know.
That's right.
And then we'll move from there.
Absolutely. Speak to what I know. You know. I love that. I like that. It's an affirmation. I'm going to put that because that's it. Exactly.
When you think about his vision, especially as a founder leader, his vision for the organization, and then when you came in, how did you find your own voice, your own direction, still meeting his vision, but leading the organization in the way that you see that it needs to be successful for the future?
I love that question. I think that is, as we said earlier, so much of the nuances of what really goes on in these transitions does not get enough like time and discussion to be brought out to the forefront. And this in particular, I feel like people don't really touch on. Perfectly honest, which is, yes, I think transitioning from any leader, whether they're a founder or an executive director, but definitely if they're a founder, that is extremely challenging. It is challenging to find your own identity in the shoes, your own sort of vision. And I'll be honest, I struggled with that. Probably that was the part I think I struggled with the most, because the founder had transitioned. And so there wasn't kind of I didn't have the opportunity, which I think is important, like the training process, right? The onboarding, where you get to kind of get some feedback along the way and say like, yes, that you're heading in the right direction, or no, I wouldn't really go that. I didn't have that. I was just like,
they were just like, here, swim.
Exactly, swim. I had no clue. And because I took the responsibility so seriously, I was almost paralyzed a bit in the beginning. I wanted so badly to not jeopardize the organization or make any decisions that I felt would do that. That I feel like it did stunt sort of my bringing of myself to the role. And so one strategy that I leaned on that I felt was effective was, before sort of kind of, instead of trying to digest the whole pizza, like cut it into slices, that idea, right? So I said, everyone's like, find your own voice. Well, that feels like eating a whole pizza. Okay.
What does that even mean?
Yeah, what does that even mean? Like, listen, find your own voice. And I was like, that's not working. So I ended up working with an amazing capacity building specialist who encouraged me to convert that, reframe that into a number of slices. So I started off, instead of what's Kahina's vision, it was, if I had to critique the current vision, the founder were still here, what might I tweak? How might I build upon, right? In like very small incremental baby things. And that was a game changer, Michelle, because I don't know if it was just a matter of psychology. It unlocked kind of what I was feeling, like that paralysis. It really undid that. And I felt the liberty and kind of the relaxation to say, because it didn't feel like I was changing everything. It felt like I was keeping what was, but I was improving upon it in a way that the founder would have loved. And what that did, and I do think it is partly psychology actually, but what that did is it gave me a safe space to accrue like some small wins that helped build my confidence over time, right? So it wasn't like, make this pivot, like having never done it. It was by the time I brought a significant, shift or new idea to the vision, I had already seen the successes of some smaller decisions that were related to the original vision. And so I felt more comfortable, still a little nervous, but I felt a lot more comfortable. So I loved that strategy. That capacity building specialist, her name is Kristen. Like, shout out to Kristen.
All right, Kristen.
She was incredible. I thought it was so genius, so brilliant, and it worked. It took I still had to be, committed, I think, always to and grounding myself in, the qualifications to make those decisions. But I just think strategically that was a big, that was a game changer for me, to be able to ultimately work my way up to contributing in larger sort of chunks my own vision, or imparting my own vision and ideas. And fast forward, we are now, let's see, I was appointed acting role in 2016. And like I said, 2 years, and then I became executive director. So in 2018, so 19, 20, 21. So three and a half years later, I feel really good about
Notice how she says it's a process. You don't just wake up and you're like, I know this.
Exactly. Absolutely not. So, and that's exactly why I gave that timeline to kind of shed light on that. So yeah, 3 years, after 2 years in an interim space. So really 5 before I could say, no, with confidence, this is what makes sense, or this is the vision, this is the direction.
I love that so much. I've always subscribed to the idea of the next best step. Once I am thinking about a decision and I'm just like, what do I do next? And there are so many options that you can paralyze and not move. So I'm like, okay, so what is the next best step?
That's right.
Because then that just takes all of the other options out, and it can be the simplest thing. Like your next best step to walk is to move the 1 foot forward.
That's right. That's
and then we do the next best step, which is move the other foot forward. And it seems simple, but
I mean, it is. You're so right. Like, I just want to, just kind of emphasize, because I think it's one of those things where people think it can't, like, it's not that simple. They think there's this
it's that simple
formula, but no, I really think that is exactly how it goes, but especially in crisis, because, and we saw that, not to like jump around, but I do want to just mention, like with COVID, I know, we had a unique situation, but I think every organization found themselves in some sort of a crisis as it relates to COVID-19 and the health pandemic. And I saw that play out so well for some organizations who, it was so easy to get overwhelmed in that, and it's still so easy for many of us to be overwhelmed. But I followed some organizations that are sort of peers of ours and watched them say, you know what, but today, what needs to happen today? And you're still being thoughtful, you're still being strategic, but I watched them do exactly that. They put 1 foot and then they put the next foot. And that doesn't seem in process like it'll get you solutions, but it works. I watched it work. And I was frozen for almost 4 weeks. And I watched this happen in organizations around me. And then I felt, okay, we're going to give this a try. And similarly, that really helped DIW, our organization, in the midst of all of this. I think it was very helpful. So yeah, I just wanted to add a little and I 100% agree with that. I love that. Yeah.
Leadership is generally defined in looking at setting the strategic vision. So you have to be the visionary, which you absolutely have to if you're going to lead. You have to give somebody a vision to follow, right? But I think we can miss out on the fact that the little details also matter. And even if you're not necessarily the one taking the little details, but helping the people who are strong at it do that. For you, you need to keep looking forward, tap into your team who's really good at the day-to-day, that vision that you have for forward. This is what it looks like on the day-to-day, and we're going to work together to do that. You've highlighted something in talking about your role that I think is a really good quality in a leader, is knowing when to look to resources. The capacity building coach that you were talking about, and looking at your peer organization, to me, that is such a smart way of leading. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about, in your transition, what other resources you tapped into and how helpful they were for you.
Absolutely. Yes, I think for one thing that I'll say is, I don't think, and this is not a new concept. I know authors and writers, like editorialists, have mentioned this before, particularly around nonprofit, but this notion of leaders, once they're in their position, not having a good recall, not having a good recall of that journey. And this notion of, the dream, the self-made success story. And it is so right. It is so harmful. It is so harmful to the industry, because it's actually not true. Like, we know from research, that's not a thing. And I actively try to undo that, where possible, with my team, with conversations. It's not about, of course, there is like, merit, and there is ownership over your actions in the space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to discredit or undermine any of that. But this notion of people operating in leadership or even reaching leadership independently, which we've seen in so many sectors and spaces, I just think we're doing ourselves a serious disadvantage, because it's not true. And even those that will argue, if I guarantee, if we challenge, and we had a real conversation to, explore or investigate, and I challenge those people to really think at every point in the journey. And honestly, can you say that you did it alone? I don't think so. So I tried to, I faced some of those, questions, I think, when I entered the space, and I really worked to actively counter them, because it's conditioning, right? I knew it wasn't true, but everything around me was still reinforcing that narrative, and that's hard. And I will name that. It is hard, but I had to really prioritize what I felt was going to get the organization to where it needed to be. And that sometimes would mean I would be uncomfortable, right? So I was like, I feel comfortable, but that's not the goal here. So if that's going to help Dance Institute, is to look outward and externally into resources, or look into my team members for resources, that's what you have to do. And I will admit, it was not comfortable. I had to start describing it for myself in a way. I had to sit down and say, of these things, where am I? I had to force myself, Michelle, to say, where are you going to solicit? Not necessarily delegate or outsource, but solicit additional expertise. It's not about what you can. I didn't even give myself the option of, can Kahina do this all? I closed that door immediately. I knew my default. I knew my weaknesses. So I think part of I just wanted to say that before jumping into the resources themselves, just how I had to retrain my thinking a bit for that to even be a thing. So I did that, and I gave myself no other option. And at that point, I looked at everything across the board, and I went the route of more of the generalist in terms of resources. I didn't feel, we had a very limited budget at the time, so I just couldn't afford to hire that many specialists in all the areas. But two, just my working style and learning style, I'm very much I like to process a lot of information and then take my time to drill down. But I'm a need to see the whole picture early type of woman. I don't want just, bits and pieces. And so I brought on board a generalist capacity builder who had been in, the financial side of nonprofit, the programming, the evaluative, the fundraising, and board development. And I had to find out how, there are various programs that can provide someone like this to nonprofits, some in the form of a grant opportunity or grant awards, some in just pro bono engagements or through pro bono engagements. And so that's the route that I went. And it was intense. Capacity building, for those who have not done it, it is intense, because all the day-to-day is still happening. And on top of that, right, you're absorbing volumes upon volumes of information and practice and theory and real and this, and it's just, but I still pushed through. And what I will say about the resources is something that I took me a while to learn, and I wish I had known earlier, is resources, the impact of the resource takes time to show up. So you may not, right? You may think and feel for example, I'll use finances. Finances was not my jam, but I knew for the immediate goals of the ED role when I inherited the organization, those were going to be top priority. And so I did a lot of work, almost like nonprofit finance boot camp is how I would describe it, 101. And it was a year, and I was like, okay, I have all this information, but I have a deficit. And I didn't understand kind of the cycle of the manifestation or like the demonstrated impact in nonprofits, because I'd never been an ED. So I was like, I don't get it. Like, I got a couple new grants. Where's my net income? I did it all.
Why didn't this work?
Right. And it's hilarious to think back on now, but I think, I mean, I see that in a lot of scenarios. Now I talk to organizations that may be going through crisis, and they'll say the same thing. They're like, we just feel like nothing's working. And I'm like, give it time. That construct, or that variable rather, of time is a part equation that we don't often give enough credit to. So that's the part I'll add on about resources, is just give yourself, factor in time, minimum a year, ideally 18 months, to start to see the impact or the fruit of that resource labor. So yeah, but that's what I did. I was saturated. I mean, it was to the point of fatigue. My team would probably say it was too much capacity building. I really did. And the last thing, sorry,
please,
this is when we talk about resources, we think, holistically and outward. But you mentioned something, Michelle, of the team and internal resources, and I have to acknowledge that. I think one of the things that was really important to me in transitioning was to establish a culture and relationships where I could get active feedback from the team. Now, this is not for the faint of heart. This type of arrangement,
they're gonna hurt your feelings.
This type of arrangement is not for the faint of heart, but my philosophy as an evaluator, I was ready for all the data. Like, I didn't care. I knew, I trusted myself to control for, the emotional, the things that I knew were not personal. I could control for those things and extract information that I knew would actually be critical. And I do think that's important, because what no one prepares you for coming into executive directorship is the isolation of it all, right?
Talk about that. Yes.
When you are a senior leader, even at the highest level, you're still part of a team. You have a department, or you might have other senior leaders, right? Other senior executives. But when you're an executive director or CEO, maybe you have a vice, president, if you're president and CEO, maybe you have a deputy director. But you run the risk, if you don't set up a foundation or a culture of feedback, you run the risk of self-isolating and eliminating pathways to relevant, critical data that you need to manage your organization. Point blank, period. There's no way around it. Your team has to have pathways. And when I say team, like, obviously not everyone in the whole organization, but critical pathways in areas that you need to have a sense of, like, the pulse. You need to have your finger on the pulse of those areas. There has to be a pathway, and you as the executive director have to create that. That is not up to the team to do, or the organization. And I think that frames really well with resources, because you also don't want to, like, burden your team with that, right? Like, it's not their job, but it's more about empowering them to serve as that type of resource. They have expertise, they have insights that can be just as significant and valuable as bringing, and sometimes more valuable than than a consultant or capacity building specialist coming from outside of the organization. And that has worked really well at DIW. Like, I am a visionary. I'm like, okay, here's where we're going. And I didn't know, I learned through these channels that, the minutia of it all was not my jam. And a lot of gaps in, and I promise you, I'm not exaggerating. I went through a period where I was so lost as to why people were confused about our direction. I was like,
she's like, it's clear. It's in my head. What? No.
It's right here. It makes perfect sense. Here's the logic model. Like, I printed it out for everyone.
You don't see this theory of change that I worked on? Like, what?
You know, and it was totally a thing. And it was some amazing team members who you said, you know, who felt comfortable saying, we get it. I see it. But I also see all of these questions from the vantage point of this team member that you don't realize it's like privileged information from your perspective that other people don't have. And you have to really walk that through and check those gaps and fill those gaps. So that's just like a little anecdote of resources. You know, the internal team members are some of the strongest resources and greatest assets, but you have to create those pathways, I think, in order for that to be, that potential and value to be realized for the organization.
You actually gave amazing advice looking at it on both sides. For somebody who is already in the pipeline to become an executive director, you're looking back and is there a pathway that's already created and open? And if not, I need to create it.
Right.
But somebody who's not yet in a formal pipeline to get to the ED role, this is a unique opportunity for you to fill a gap that your ED has, and they may not have already done the work to create that pathway. So you coming up, when you're thinking about your career trajectory, how are you meeting this need for your ED to get the information that they need? Because they need to go out and sell the organization, right? Yes. And they can't do that
exactly
without those stories to tell. They can't do that without the data that you're providing. So if for some reason you're working in an organization where the pathway is not already created for you to bring that information to the ED, how do you create that pathway if you're looking to formalize your leadership?
That's a great question. I think in these conversations, I recommend leading with, so it's going to sound a little simple, but leading with,
we like simple.
with identifying like problems and solutions. But I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that. So I think we talked a bit about kind of the premise around leadership or people in power and them like having all the answers or being the most experienced. And the reality is they do not.
It's just formalized leadership.
Exactly. And so one of the ways that I think is an opportunity to create a pathway that kind of cuts through the social kind of dynamics of like, of power and like, you know, people feeling maybe that, because for example, if you're in a position that is supervised or governed, there are a lot of things that might present barriers to feeling like you can create that pathway. Maybe you don't want to step on anyone's toes. Maybe you don't want to come across as, you know, encroaching on others' authorities. But I think the framing, not even the framing, the catalyst or sort of the motive, that's the word I'm looking for. The motivation is with the motivation of solving a problem, right? Or seeing where something can be improved. That is like almost what I call a neutralizer. It's like a power neutralizer.
That's a really good one. Yep.
It's a power neutralizer. And what it does is if there is a leader, let's say, and maybe for their own reasons, maybe it's their own insecurities, maybe it's, you know, bandwidth or what have you, they seem to not be open to creating those pathways in your organization, or they just haven't thought about it and they don't have the time. What bringing solutions to problems does is it neutralizes any of those possible defense pop-ups, because you're not coming to them with with like threat or an interest in their position, which is what some people think or anticipate. And you're also addressing the bandwidth concern, because guess what? You're bringing them a solution. So there isn't the argument to say, oh, I don't have time. No. I'm not asking for your time. I'm not asking you to help me think. I'm just bringing this to you as a solution. That initial action, I think, opens a gateway for building and like kind of cultivating a relationship that eventually will become a pathway. And the reason I can at least describe that is because I have also been in circumstances like prior to being an ED where that was the situation for me. And I was in a career opportunity where it was just sheer bandwidth. The leader did not have the space, I think, the headspace to create those kinds of opportunities. They had been kind of thrown in, and there were a lot of competing priorities. And I noticed every time I was looking to move up in the department at this organization. Yeah. And I just kept getting shut down. And it wasn't because they weren't interested or they could see the qualifications. It was just always a matter of like, I don't have time to think about this, or like, we don't have time to think about that.
Yeah.
So I had to figure out how to make my time like valuable for them. And I realized, okay, how do I sort of finesse this as for me, but something off your plate? And it worked.
Yeah.
And very quickly, not very quickly, it was still like 6 months, but still, in a short amount of time, in less than a year, I would say, I had rapport now with that leader, and I could come to them, and it wasn't like a formal, like, here is how I need feedback from employees, but I became sort of unofficially that go-to to like the director on the team. Where they trusted me, they confided in me, and that ultimately led to an opportunity. I ended up leaving the organization for another opportunity, but it would have led to, I think, a formalized leadership opportunity.
I still love stickers, and I reward people with stickers. I wish I could just give you a gold sticker right now. To say how much I absolutely love this this setup that you've helped people to think through, because I think it's so easy to get frustrated that you're not moving forward in the formalized leadership roles, and then thinking, well, I can't get any time with you. No one's willing to invest in my career here.
Yes.
But like you said, what solutions can I put in place for challenges that I'm already seeing, not to circumvent whatever pathway that they had set up, but that it's a great way to circumvent whatever pathway that they had set up. Yeah, of course I'm going to take time because it's going to solve a problem for me.
Exactly.
It just brings me back to the fact that every day when you're doing the work, and it's something that I talk to my team about, your work is never just the day-to-day.
Yes.
And the moment you stop connecting what your day-to-day means to the larger strategy and to the larger mission and how to move that forward is the moment that you kind of box yourself in and kind of cut off opportunities for you to get into more formalized leadership, right? And I differentiate between formalized leadership and leadership because I think anybody in any position can lead. It's the recognition with the title and the compensation. But you can lead in your particular role, and you have to see it that way.
I love that.
The elephant in the room for me. So in 2019, I had written an article called Nonprofits So White. I remember listening to the whole Oscars So White debate, and I remember just laughing, not laughing because I didn't know that it was true. I was like, you think Oscar's white? You should see nonprofit. Like, I have been in spaces as part of the senior leadership team, and I'm looking around and I'm like, oh, okay. So we serve all these Black and brown kids, but all the decision makers are definitely not Black and brown. They're studies galore. For the last 15 years, it's remained under 20% that leaders of color in the ED role or in the CEO role. In New York City, where I am, over 69% of nonprofit CEOs and EDs were white. It's just mind-boggling that the people who get to create the strategies, who get to make the decisions, are not reflective of the communities we're serving. We are mission-driven people. Are we doing a service to our staff, our people, as much as we are doing to the constituents that we're serving? So we tend to forget to support in-house as much as we're supporting out-house. And the people that get left out are the people who are doing the direct service. You said when you first started, your entire board, male, you're a young female, you're Black, you're in spaces, women of color, specifically Black women, get underfunded running organizations where you're getting $1 million unrestricted grant to a white person who's just like, oh, I want to test this out. Here's this $1 million. For us, it's like, so I need 15 years of data to prove that this thing that we are trying actually works. So how do you navigate being a young Black woman in this nonprofit leadership space with all of the challenges that the studies have shown are there?
Woo! Question right here. It's like, where do I begin? I have so many thoughts.
Tell us your thoughts.
Firstly, so this actually, well, first I do want to talk about just the internal and indirect services, and it's layered, right? It's layered because compounded on everything we've just talked about in terms of equity and inequity, I think there are layers, right? So typically in nonprofits where there might be a higher representation of minorities, they are in the direct service roles, which are the, if out of everyone in the organization, if an organization has the most, topsy-turvy, inequitable, sort of internal care policy, HR stuff, it is most felt in the direct services realm. It is most felt in the direct services realm. And I think there is such a catch-22 because in the direct service realm, which my organization is in, we do some systems work, but predominantly direct services. The mission and just the nature of the day-to-day work, it really doesn't allow. I think we talk about the agency to like give boundaries and set parameters, and that's great. But when you're in it and there's like a child in your building who has not gotten picked up and it's 9 p.m., you don't have the option to just go home and leave that here, right? And that's direct services. So it's funny because it's often, I'm just gonna say it, let me just say this. I think
this is a safe space. We are here to create these conversations. Exactly. Yeah.
I think one of the greatest things I did to start to tackle this was I put the people most feeling it the most leading the conversation. Nothing frustrates me more than the people in positions of privilege leading the conversation on how to make these people in these direct services experiences make their experience more equitable and protecting their mental health and doing all that. Stop. Just stop. Put the people closest to the experience like at the center of the conversation. We have to start doing that. I did that at DIW coming out of COVID. Just to give personal, example, we were not staffed to go immediately from virtual into on-site with all of the sort of schedule, block scheduling that is required to maintain COVID compliance and safe distance.
Got it. Okay.
So you kind of needed to double up. in terms of staffing and things like that. And so what did everyone do at this lovely mission-based organization? Just jump in. And it took me about 3 weeks to realize people are coming into the office 7 days a week.
Ooh, okay. Yeah.
People are coming into the office 7 days a week. And so what I see happen, and this is what not to do, what I see happen is then executive leadership gets together and they talk to a funder and they come up with a policy for how to make that more equitable. And then they present it to the team members. That is the pattern we see. And it does not work. It is not equitable. Newsflash to everyone that thinks it is. It is not. Instead, what should be done is a conversation that starts with those people whose livelihoods are being impacted by what they are doing in service of your organization.
Pause. Let us pause. Let that flow. Listen to me. Current leaders, let's lean in a second.
Yes.
Current leaders, do you hear Miss Kahina Haynes dropping this on you? Equity is not equity if you are leading the conversation when it's not your livelihood it's impacting. Do you hear this? Do you hear it? Soak it in.
Yes.
Soak it in. Do you hear this?
Exactly. I love this.
Like, why do we have to? Well, she has to say it because it's happening.
Yes.
Clearly.
Yes.
Go ahead. I'm just gonna sit back and go ahead.
Exactly. Those individuals, those people lead the conversation, and you give them the platform to articulate. They, as we've said so many times, they are empowered and knowledgeable more so often than those of us who are more distant from the work. And their voices matter the most in this conversation, and they need that. That is how you lead with equity. That is how you practice it, parts of it, And so with that, I think that's the biggest mistake I see happening, and why we have not been able to master or kind of wrap our hands around this balance. I think it's because exactly what you said, Michelle, the right people are not given the platform and the opportunity to lead those conversations. And we are imposing spending lots of time, energy, and resources on policies and ideas and recommendations that go nowhere. And it's really sad because, again, these are people's lives. And we have a responsibility. You have a responsibility. So at DIW, absolutely not. And I literally had a conversation this morning where I checked in, and I was like, if I'm needed in the conversation, let me know. But I'm not part of that conversation as a Black woman because I'm the ED. I'm not part. They are having the conversation, and they are going to share with me the recommendations, right? Like, that is how this works. That is how this works. And if we can get people to just like get that, really move this industry. So that's my soapbox spiel.
Girl, you got a whole
nocturnal.
I'm gonna give you some crates. You can just stack them.
Yeah, like that kind of thing. And then the other layer that comes into the other layers to this that I do think are important are what I think, in addition to what we have said, I also think that I say this a lot at our organization, and I say it a lot with conversations with funders. And it's a little controversial, but I say it to them anyway. I'm like, look, value is relative. Let's not pretend that it's not. It is relative, and it is a function, right? It's a construct. Value is a construct, and it is often a function of like capital and power and influence. And so when you are a bajillion-dollar nonprofit and you say, oh, we want to be equitable, but then you come out with a list of what matters on that equity list that you came up with in your closet somewhere, like that does detriment. Like, I want to just name that is detrimental to the sector, because you have now placed value on something or on things that you have no knowledge of, where like the capacity of the industry, the ability of the industry, and even the ethical like imperative of the industry to also do and like place the same power and value on those things. And when it comes to this elephant in the room conversation, I just want to name, like, I do think it's important to name this. I think we always, unfortunately, still today, Black leaders, particularly women, do have to be mindful, because there aren't always safe spaces like this to name that. And I think that's something that I want to recognize, even in my own privilege, right? That I can I can say that in some spaces with funders, and there are peers of mine or counterparts who cannot. And that in itself is a problem. And that setting of safety is not the obligation of those who are feeling unsafe. That is what I mean when I'm talking about value as a construct, and the power, and like knowing the power that you have to create and ensure spaces for these conversations to happen. And the next question, well, what does that look like? It looks like you don't not fund an organization because they called you out. You don't do that. Those practices reinforce spaces, and spaces where we can't have transparent conversations. And I, for one, am really frustrated with the claim to allyship, but with those types of practices still happening. And it does happen. It is happening very much in the philanthropic sector. And it's, I just don't see how we have this expectation to really move the pendulum in this area without that being recognized. It's not just about how you invest your dollars. It's so much deeper than that. It's about the approach, the strategy, the acknowledgement of the things that maybe aren't meant to be a thing, but are a thing. It's very layered, but I just wanted to make sure I said that, because I have been on the other side when I was not an executive director, and I felt like oftentimes there were things I wanted to say that I couldn't say. I didn't feel like I could say them, and that's very real. That is very, very real, and like safety first and foremost. But it definitely, it's so layered. I think those two though are like, they really grind my gears, in case you couldn't tell. Like the whole like, oh, it's equity, but it's not. I don't. Like, I have such a low tolerance for that conversation. And the second part is just the nature of the nature, the recognition, like just the transparency, the acknowledgement of the impact of power, like in real time. And let's name it, and let's acknowledge it. And it doesn't look like we're acknowledging that we have power. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in the aftermath of these conversations, what you do and how you show up, and how are you protecting organizations and leaders who went out on a limb to have that candid conversation in a safe space, right? Allyship also looks like protection of them after the fact, which also looks like dollars, because dollars translates to security.
That's it. Thank you. Yep.
It translates into security. So, but I think, we have a ways to go. We have a ways to go. We got to do better. We have to do better in the industry.
So the almost it's retaliation. It's not almost retaliation. That if you as a leader of color speak out on people claiming to be equitable and not actually practicing equity, and having to face that, how much do you balance needing to speak up and also protecting your organization's ability to serve, because we know that we need their dollars, right?
Yeah.
So if you are going to face retaliation, when do you decide what hill to die on? And
No.
when do you scale it back? Like what does that look like in a decision tree for you?
That's a really good question. And I've actually I think about this all the time. I think I probably think about this every day. I'm faced with some of these decisions on an almost daily basis. And I don't know that I have, like, I wouldn't describe, because my experience has evolved, and I don't know that it's been the same enough for me to necessarily qualify it as like a recommendation. Like, I wouldn't want to do that, but I can just speak openly about what I have done. But yeah, I'll qualify it by saying, like, it may not work for people. But I have approached this very much like a chess game, almost, because war is negative and I'm not a fan of war. But like a chess game, I really do. And I think, yeah, this might be unpopular opinion, but we need to, when there's responsibility at stake, when you're responsible for people's lives, this is not your theoretical playground. Like, let's just name that. You can't go wielding your, theoretical sword and going into battle off of, the strength. You just cannot do that. It's unfortunately, because it's calculated risk is really what we're talking about here, right? It's calculated risk. And so I tend to do it I take those choices very seriously, and I weigh them. I do actual analysis, and I examine things like not only like likelihood of, retaliation, but I also look at my sort of pedigree, my fluency in what it is, and should this funder retaliate, or should they try to challenge? How comfortable am I with what I'm saying? How grounded can I stand in what I am bringing to the table? And I think that's where I do see sometimes this approach backfires badly, unfortunately, like where that lens, because there's not a naivete. It's not naive. We should be in a world where you don't have to think that way. We should be in a world where you can say, this is what, as a leader, this is what I think about this organization, and you can feel grounded and secure in that. But because we don't exist in a world like that, I don't think we all, like leaders who are responsible for lives and organizations, always have that luxury. And I think that's okay. I think that's like, a lot of things in life are like that, but we don't name that. And because we don't name it, and we're all kind of like utopian about it when it's not. Like, what I'm talking about in terms of like the relativity of this, right? Where people think, oh, it's level playing field. No, it's not. Stop telling people that. You're for detriment. You're not setting them up for success. It's not level. And so I think naming that reality and being okay with that affords you to say, I can make choices. That's also a right that I have, right? As someone who's looking to advance equity, I can elect of my own volition, not because you told me to or not to, but because I did strategic analysis and I came to the conclusion that this made sense for me to bring up in this space, or this did not make sense. And a lot of people, like, so when we think about racial justice, social justice, some of the most impactful leaders, this is also not talked about a lot, were not just, they were strategic. It was not just all day, every day, say what I think. People confuse that because in the history books, we only see those situations. But I promise you, if some, if a civil rights activist were in a particular location on a given day, what we're not going to do because of safety, right? Calculated risk. And I think I don't think the privileged section has any interest in making sure those of us who are on the advocating side, and I don't mean advocacy capital A, but those of us who are trying to push, change this game, there is the interest that we think is there to name these things. Don't count on that. Do not count on that, because that is where I have just seen it go wrong so many times. And I don't think that that's, trying to find the right words, but that I do feel like that is my responsibility, and that it's my sort of at my discretion to decide that I do not let privileged white-led foundations tell me when I can enter or exit these types of conversations, because they are not at and their organizations are not at risk. And
let me go ahead and fix my brain real quick.
That's what it is. I feel like I was like struggling to like figure out the words and trying to like be diplomatic. But to your question of how do I balance that? That's it in a nutshell. I balance it. With the factors that I want to weigh in this, and for the opinions and from the people who I want involved in the decision. And what I think I'm trying to say is that there is assumption or thinking that in that decision you need to involve like the populations and entities that are in power. And what I'm saying is I have seen that backfire. And I don't think it's a good strategy. I don't think it's a requirement. I think we have the capacity, those of us who run the organization, who work at the organization, who are in the work on the front lines, know the industry, we can decide if and when we have these conversations and how, and we define the parameters, right? And just to like really just distill it, because I know this has been a very like meta conversation, but here's what that looks like. This looks like an email that invites you to a conversation. For those who may not know, that's what that looks like. A conversation with a foundation for you to talk about their practices. Be very cautious, right? Because that's what I mean by really good intentions. But the question is, does that foundation, is it a priority for them to control for the power dynamic, to protect you from any possible retaliatory, decisions that get made after that conversation? And what I'm just saying is, you as an executive director, as a team member, whatever, have a right to reframe that. You don't have to be influenced by that invite to in these spaces of having these conversations, and when to kind of articulate candidly what our thoughts are, what could be improved, what could be more equitable. That's what I'm talking about, those instances. And I think what happens more often than not is we get excited about the invite and we think that's the pathway to change, and it backfires. I've seen it happen. I have had it happen to me. So when you ask about the balance, that I think is the biggest thing that I've learned, and that's what I do differently now. When I get an invite, it's going to be at my organization. I don't go to other people's organizations anymore. You want to learn about DIW, you're going to come here.
Come to DIW.
Come to DIW. If you have questions about my work and things like that, like I also ask who's going to be at this conversation. Because I've definitely walked into meetings where the entire board is present and I'm the only person from my organization. And I'm expecting
about imbalance of power.
I'm invited to talk about my thoughts on the application process that I think could make it more equitable. Like, that's just not a safe setup for me to then articulate those things. And I then said, you know what? I have a choice. I can choose to take this conversation, or I can choose to not. And we just have to keep in mind we have those choices. We have that agency, and nobody is looking out for your safety and your organization's safety like you. Stop believing other people that tell you you are, because they fund you. Because that's a different interest. That's a different interest.
When you are making those strategic decisions, are there times that those decisions don't seem as correct with your board as they do for you, and how do you balance that? And I'll ask this question and then I have one more so we can wrap up.
Sure. Absolutely. There is a lot. There are many times, in fact, where, and I think that has to do with the unique composition. Everyone's board is different. But I also think just the composition and the relationship between a board and executive director, where your perspective is different, your landscape is different. And so more often for me, where there's disconnect, it has been that perspective difference. And so what I try to do is I really try to convey the landscape that I'm operating in. I try to really provide as succinctly as possible what my purview is. How am I seeing it? It's a little bit almost like empathy exercise. Like I try to get them in my shoes, so to speak. And that is, we really actually do an exercise, Michelle. Like where sometimes I encourage people, it's an envisioning exercise where I have to close their eyes, because, that is, I think when it comes to communication and really important decisions, I do think it's important to control for that variance in perspective to make sure the ultimate decision really is, the best decision. And if you do that exercise and the opinions kind of still hold, I feel more comfortable saying, okay, well, for reasons that I may not fully understand, like let's revisit, but I gave the opportunity, I presented or sort of crafted the space for board members and others to really see it from my lens. And if after then there are still questions and concerns, we will discuss them and I won't push forward. But almost always, once I do that exercise, I mean, it happens. They go, oh, I never really thought of it like that. Oh, now that you put it like that. And I'm like,
it goes back to your expertise and bringing that knowledge base that they don't have, right? You have a different set of information that they don't know. And even if they know the same information, it doesn't translate the same because you're in the work.
Exactly. And I sometimes take that, not for granted, but I forget that people have different entries into executive directorship. So that is something I feel like this goes without saying, but it doesn't hurt to say, like, new EDs or those that might be coming from outside. I really think that's one of the best things that one can do is to really learn the work, like do the work, take some time and actually do it. Like there's no about it. Don't be fluent in the website and the annual reports. No, nothing will position you better, I think, for like that type of dynamic, right? With like board and ED or even funder and ED, than having that knowledge that you can really stand solidly on.
Want to honor the time that you've given us. I'll do just two more questions because one of it you tapped into. I was thinking about what you have done to set yourself up for success in the role. I heard giving yourself the capacity building time where you were learning, this is what my predecessor wanted for the organization. And these are the things that are still meaningful, and then figuring out what I want for it differently, as opposed to just jumping in and being like, I have to change the vision and, giving yourself a heart attack because now you have to give a whole different vision and lead the staff completely different way. So is that one of those things that you would say, setting yourself up for success, really just taking the time to do the bite-sized best next steps exercise?
Yes, 100%. I would say yes. And I would also say, don't wait too long to think about the who. So it's like, so by that, I mean, what do I mean by that? By that, I mean, when you're taking the bite sizes, I guess what I'm trying to say is don't do that in isolation, right? So as you're part of setting, I feel part of what set me up for success was that I engaged, even in the beginning, at different points, various people throughout the organization in that capacity building. And that was a game changer, I think, for DIW. Whereas I don't know that that's common. I don't know that that's conventional, honestly. There might be people that say that's a terrible idea. But that's what I did, is I really thought about the who, because I had read and seen some case studies of companies and organizations that, have a perfect crystallized vision, but then the lift of getting the buy-in of it and the comprehension and digesting of it takes another 3 years. And I just was kind of piloted this, I was like, I don't want to have to do that. So what might it look like throughout this process to engage some strategic who's throughout the organization? And it was, I had to spend a lot of time to articulate what was happening, because I don't think that's common practice. And people at first were like, wait, what? Like, what is this meeting about? Like, why am I here? But now fast forward, and, you can see the effects of that. And I think that, I don't know that it set me up for success, but it mitigated what I think is a potential pitfall of how we think about setting ourselves up for success. A lot of new EDs are like, me as the ED, and like having success. But it's like, that's a function though of everyone around you. It's an ecosystem, right?
Perfectly put. Yeah, absolutely. What would you say was reality a year or two in versus the expectation?
Oh man. Wow. I'm laughing because they could not be further apart. I mean, that goes without saying for many of us. I know I'm not alone in that, where we have, you don't know what a real expectation is in the beginning. You do your best to make it something that's reasonable and viable, but the nonprofit is the nonprofit sector. It's going to be what it's going to be. And, I think that I had to really, it took me a while to understand. I kind of hinted at this earlier, but just the cycle of like change and absorption at the organizational level. And I think that's true at any type of organization, company, for-profit, NGO, what have you, startup, what have you. The fact that it's a vehicle, it's not like working, autonomously or in a small group. It's a whole body of personalities and people and variables. Yes, it's all of that. And so you have to create space in setting your expectations for things to go differently. And for those of us who love control and we love data and predictability.
If you don't see her in the audio, she's pointing at herself.
That is a huge adjustment. And it's an important one, because how you measure success is defined by what you set as your goals and expectations. If you're not being reasonable, this is very important for new EDs. You can run the risk of thinking you've done a terrible job when in fact you've done a bang up job, right? All of that is determined by what you had set as those goals. And I learned that the hard way. I literally, again, we're talking theoretically, but put this in real terms. I said for DIW, I wanted my biggest priority in the beginning was the finances. And my expectation that I set in year one, well, let me just talk about the trajectory. Now that I'm an ED, now I've been it for some years, I'm very proud of this trajectory. But at the time, and I'll get to that, I was not. But here's been the trajectory. We went from $500,000 deficit.
Wow.
And in the following year, that deficit was cut in half.
Wow.
The year after that, we were in the black. And the year after that, and every year since then, including 2020, the organization's earned revenue has gone up, the balance sheet has improved, and we've not ended in a deficit. Now,
amen. All right.
And so the budget has sort of crept up in a very short time, very aggressively. But first year ED, Kahina, was just absolutely devastated when I saw that I still had a deficit at the end of the year. I mean, you couldn't tell me anything. I thought, I just knew I'd failed. I said this was failure. Now, why did I feel that way? Well, because the goal I had set was to be in the positive. That's not a realistic goal.
You inherited $500,000 debt and you were like, oh, guess what? I'm just going to turn this ship around and we're going to be a $10 million organization tomorrow.
That. Like that. You know, and I think, and so part of it is, no, that's just not realistic.
No,
and you've got to set realistic goals, because once you go back and you measure your performance against them, how you feel about that is determined by that goal. And the other reason that it's important to be very intentional about that is that whether we mean to or not, I feel like a lot of directors feel a personal responsibility for the performance of the organization. Now, listen, that right there is something you will always work on, because I just think that's human nature, is to feel like you are responsible for something that has its own life and its own way of operating. But there's an association, your relationship, your affiliation to the organization is such that you feel responsible. And that's why I mentioned that create space. Create space in your goals or your metrics for things to not go that way. So that way, when, you know, it's the year end and maybe you had set sights on minimal attrition. Well, how much really can you control that, even as the executive director? When that is informed by people. This is a social, you know, industry. This is sociology. These are humans, and they're complex, and their lives are complex. You cannot rest your performance on controlling or restricting what other people are going to do or not do. You can do all the projections in the world, but people have autonomy, which we want to be celebrated and we want to be encouraged. And so creating that space was something I learned a couple years in that was a game changer and helped me not feel that significant variance between like the realities that I was experiencing and my expectations. My expectations, over the years, I got to have them be a little more realistic. But then on top of that, I started creating spaces, like literally question marks in the dashboard. Like all we know is that this is going to look different. That might be the goal, but I won't define by how much or by when.
Can I tell you, the fact that you just said that you're creating in your goal space question mark, you just let me tell you, the nervousness of being a formalized leader and being like, I don't know. Right. I don't know.
Yep.
Everybody's looking to you for the answer, and for you to turn around and know that you have this space and it's okay and it's actually healthy to say, I don't know.
Yes.
To me, that is probably one of the biggest service you could do yourself in preparing for the transition, is sitting in the I don't know.
Yes, Michelle. Yes.
Oh my goodness. And you hear her in that I don't know has served you, because your organization went from a $500,000 deficit. You came in, you brought it, you cut that in half. The next year you were in the black, and every year since. So there is room in that I don't know for you to just figure it out and to adjust to make it work. If you don't take anything else away from this, you don't have to have all the answers as the executive director. And I think a lot of people are going to cut themselves off before they even go down this path, because they're like, well, I don't know the answer to this. I don't know the answer to that.
Yes.
That's fine.
That's fine. In fact, it might be better. I agree with you, Michelle. It might be actually better, because not knowing creates space. You might know something, and 6 months down the line, new information presents itself that would have contributed significantly to how you thought about that problem or decision.
Yeah.
It's not the most comfortable space to be in, but that I like what you said about preparing yourself to sit in, because that is also practice, that has to be worked on and has to be reinforced. But I think that is spot on. Practicing that and getting comfortable with that is sometimes to your advantage.
Oh my goodness, this was such an amazing conversation.
Yes.
I even begin to thank you for making yourself available to share your knowledge and yourself. There's so much that you dropped there that I'm just like, take a pen, take a paper, just sit and just take notes.
Thank you.
Would love to hear how people can connect with you, how people can support your organization. Just tell us a little bit.
Absolutely. So please, if you are interested in connecting with me or even learning more about the Dance Institute of Washington, please visit our website, www.danceinstituteofwashington.org. Also, find me on Instagram. I'm at Kahina Haynes, first and last name. I'm still figuring out Instagram bullshit. You please do hit me up. I love connecting with others. I just think so much of this is just pulling the curtain back. So I love conversations like this. I'm happy to have more of them with anyone who's interested. So thank you, Michelle, ultimately for the platform and for the space. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. And I think there is a part 2 of this to come, because there's so many other layers that I want to unfold. But thank you, everybody. Again, thank you for joining Road to Lead. And we look forward to continuing this conversation on transitioning to formalized leadership. So thanks again, Kahina.
Thank you.
Goodbye.